Can I ask you a bit of a weird question? What is the purpose of true crime? What does it do? You're watching We're in Hell.
Hello to all you necro heads out there, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Exhibition.
We are into his house! Bow, bow, bow!
And speaking of in the house, for Air Canada Gal, September 25th, 2010 started like any other day. She got off work at 6 o'clock, which was pretty normal for her. She drove to her house, which she shared with her partner, Dolphin Girl. She arrived at the house at some time between 6:30 and 7 p.m.
So, we don't actually know the exact time that she arrived home at?
No, and that's actually one of the things the detectives found challenging later, was pinning down the time she got home. So at some point in this window, she arrived home and opened her door, unaware that her life was about to change forever.
Hello, boys, ghouls, and non-binary jewels. I hope that you're all having a frightful Halloween.
Fuck that. Fuck, we're not doing that. That's stupid. I'm sorry. This is like gonna be a long video too. Can you imagine if this was the whole time woke Crypt Keeper puns? Hey everyone who's still watching. For this very special Halloween edition of We're in Hell, we're gonna talk about true crime. True crime is one of those things like astrology where, at least when I was a kid, it was like trashy, but now every girl I know is obsessed with it. By the way, my stance on astrology is that I don't believe in it, but the way it'll piss off the most annoying types of guys is hilarious and has made me a critical supporter. Although maybe there is something to it. I mean, I get all these comments that say that I'm Cancer, and I'm like, dude, that's crazy. How did you know I was born June 25th? So, what is true crime? Basically, it's a non-fiction genre that focuses on the details of crimes. Wikipedia also describes it as trash culture. So that description's a little broad, not to mention harsh, although what do I know, I am a culture raccoon. True crime can take lots of different forms, ranging from podcasts to TV shows to documentaries to airport books to great books to the evening news. And while I do think trash culture is a bit much, there is definitely lots to criticize true crime for. Please don't close the video. I swear this is gonna get more interesting than just a bunch of true crime is canceled hot takes. But first, an exhaustive list of true crime is canceled hot takes. Hot take the first. True crime is often quite exploitative and disrespectful towards victims of crimes and their families, as Sarah Zed talks about in her great video about American Vandal. Also, shows like Cops and The First 48 can function as propaganda, as Skip Intro points out in his great video about the subject. There's also the fact that so many of the podcasts I listened to when I was researching this are sponsored by home alarm companies, which can be an extremely sketchy industry in its own right. By the way, did you know that you probably spend more time being watched on security camera in America than in China? But that's somehow okay because it's capitalists doing it instead of the government. There's also the issue of what gets categorized as true crime versus just crime. Right? Like, there's nowhere near as many podcasts talking about the unsolved murders of black and brown people in shitty neighborhoods as there are about middle-class white women getting kidnapped in the suburbs. And another criticism is that being really into true crime
seems more than a little serial killer-y. And this is the criticism that I think is the least founded. It kind of reminds me of the old playing violent video games will turn kids into school shooters argument. And I do get it. Like, it is definitely weird when I'll be, like, talking to a girl, in theory, and I'll ask her what she's into, and her response is just murder. But when you check out true crime, like, at all, especially with the podcast, it becomes pretty clear that the focus of the show is not how to become a good serial killer so much as it is how to avoid getting killed by one. There is a reason that these shows are sponsored by home security systems, not latex glove manufacturers. As I said earlier, the majority of true crime fans are people who aren't straight men. People who are a bit more justified in their fear of getting put in someone's trunk. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, this video isn't going to be about why true crime is problematic. It's going to be about why it's necessary.
When Air Canada gal got inside the house, it was completely silent, which was unusual since she would normally be able to hear Dolphin Girl splashing around in the tub.
Right, that seems really strange since Dolphin Girl was probably pretty loud.
Right, so she went upstairs to investigate, but what she found in the bathroom was horrifying. First of all, there was blood everywhere, as well as ropes and handcuffs in the bathtub, but no Dolphin Girl.
Wait, so you're saying there was blood everywhere, but Dolphin Girl wasn't there?
Yeah. Air Canada gal was shocked. She was freaking out, right? But she noticed a trail of blood on the floor, so she walked out of the bathroom to investigate.
The question I want to answer in this video is, what is the purpose of true crime? One pretty obvious answer would be that it's to inform people. I mean, it is non-fiction.
In the name
true crime. The problem with this, though, is that while, yes, true crime does usually provide the true facts of a crime, it's actively terrible at informing its viewers about broader trends in crime. A study found that heavy consumers of true crime are actually less informed about the true crime rate than members of the general public, since their heavy consumption of crime stories makes them think that gruesome murders are just happening constantly. In order to understand true crime, we're first going to have to go back to its origins. I think the most interesting thing I've learned in researching this video is just how old true crime is. Like, it has literally been in print since we invented the printing press. Like, there's this one hilarious Chinese book of true crime stories that dates back to the Ming dynasty, and it's just full of these really funny, like, dumb, low-level cons. And this is a translation, but coaxing a sister-in-law into adultery to scam oil and meat, or pilfering green cloth by pretending to steal a goose. Honestly, though, who among us hasn't lost just swaths of green cloth to would-be goose thieves? The earliest true crime we have, though, comes from 16th century Germany, which is where and when the printing press was invented. Clergymen would sell or give out pamphlets that included horrifying stories of true crime meant to shock people into acting morally by showing them the consequences of a life of sin. The stories would have titles like, "A True and Most Horrifying Account of How a Woman Tyrannically Murdered Her 4 Children and Also Killed Herself." You'll never guess what that one's about.
She first went for the eldest son, attempting to cut off his head. He quickly to the window sped to try if he could creep outside. By the leg she pulled him back inside and threw him down onto the ground.
Ladies, if you skip church, you're gonna wind up murdering your kids. That's just how it works. There are a few interesting things about this. For one, historians don't think that the church made any money off of these. At best, they'd be breaking even. Also, I get that this is how academia works, but it is so funny to me that there are people who've devoted their lives to working out the business model of the 16th century equivalent of chick tracts. But this is evidence against another criticism of pulpier forms of true crime, which is that they're just a cash grab. I mean, I'm sure that that is true to some extent, but also this shows that there is some non-monetary motivation for true crime. But I think the most interesting thing that you see when you take a historical look at true crime is how the types of crimes that get covered change. 16th century Germany was a point of rapid social change, and at that time, you started to see a lot of stories of mothers murdering their kids. In a paper by Joy Wiltenburg, she argues that depicting this kind of violence on the most fundamental forms of social interactions mirrored fears from that time about the changing nature of society. Later, post-Reformation Protestants were pushing for basically parental controls over marriage, and around that time, you start to see more depictions of married couples killing each other, a mirror to societal anxieties around illegitimate marriages. As Wiltenburg writes,
"The crimes featured in sensationalist accounts were not the most common, but rather those perceived as most horrifying."
I would argue that you can see true crime's fixations on LGBTQ people and Satanists throughout the 20th century as tapping into the cultural anxieties of their time in the same way. Even more recently, I think this has kind of been flipped on its head. In a time of increasing awareness of police brutality, I don't think it's a coincidence that the most popular true crime stories are things like Serial and Making a Murderer, shows where the horror comes not from the crime committed so much as the arguable imprisonment of an innocent person. Essentially, true crime acts as a sort of social control, enforcing the norms of a society by depicting the most graphic violations of those norms. It's fucking rush hour outside. God damn it. Fucking Fast and the Furious out there, just zoom, zoom, zoom. And this doesn't just mean that true crime tells people how not to behave. When they condemn something, they're kind of implicitly affirming its opposite. For example, when someone condemns the act of rioting, they are implicitly supporting the value of private property.
True Crime Exhibition is proudly sponsored by Blackwater Home Defense Systems. For years, Blackwater has worked to protect our freedoms abroad, and now they're bringing that expertise literally to your front door.
We always talk about this. You simply cannot count on the police to protect you, but with my Blackwater home security system, I can sleep soundly knowing that any intruders will be shot on sight. And that's a promise.
It has never been easier to hire private mercenaries to defend your home. And for a limited time, if you use our promo code at the checkout, you'll receive 1 month of Raytheon Predator drone support absolutely free.
This all relates to the theories of a French sociologist named Émile Durkheim. Durkheim was arguably the first person to legitimize the field of sociology, and his work went on to form the basis for the sociological theory of functionalism. Functionalism is one of the big three foundational theories of sociology, along with symbolic interactionism, which I talk about in my Crappy Jobs video, and conflict theory, which is essentially just Marxism, which I talk about in every one of my videos. Functionalists analyze things by asking what that thing does for society, or basically, what is its function. And when it comes to crime, Durkheim's hot take was that it's good, actually. Well, not exactly. Durkheim didn't think that crime was good, but that it was necessary. Like pain, or me reading my YouTube comment section. These things are horrible experiences, but are physiologically necessary. First of all, Durkheim argued that every society has had crime, and even if there was some magical place where everyone was a perfect person and no one did anything wrong, there would still be people in that society who would violate the rules and be considered criminals, even if degenerate scumbags like you or I wouldn't think that they had done anything wrong. You might even say that old Durkheim predicted cancel culture. Kill me. And so, Durkheim figured that if something is a necessary ingredient in any society, it must serve some kind of purpose. And when it comes to crime, he argues that the purpose it serves is to define the border between what is and isn't acceptable. From this view, crime is necessary because it allows us to define ourselves in opposition to it. This isn't like just saying that if there were no murderers, we wouldn't think murder was bad. The functionalist view is that a culture can't exist without defining itself in opposition to those outside of it. There has to be an us and a them. For Durkheim and functionalists, part of forming that group identity involves labeling certain behaviors as deviant and anyone who engages in them as other. Crime, then, is the experience of outgroup behavior invading the interior. I think this in part feeds into why true crime is so white and upper middle class. In a society that views those groups as the norm, there's a greater horror to crime invading those spaces where it supposedly shouldn't belong. Part of the fascination with Ted Bundy, for example, is that this horrifying murderer was in fact a handsome, well-spoken white dude, someone who, by all accounts, should fit within society's in-group. An important thing to understand with Durkheim and later functionalists is that no act is inherently criminal in and of itself. Instead, certain behaviors become deviant or criminal because they offend what Durkheim calls the collective conscience.
Since there cannot be a society in which the individuals do not differ more or less from the collective type, it is also inevitable that, among these divergences, there are some with a criminal character. What confers this character upon them is not the intrinsic quality of a given act, but that definition which the collective conscience lends them. If the collective conscience is stronger, if it has enough authority, practically, to suppress these divergences, it will also be more sensitive, more exacting, and, reacting against the slightest deviations with the energy it otherwise displays only against more considerable infractions, it will attribute to them the same gravity as formerly to crimes. In other words, it will designate them as criminal.
Now, some of you may have noticed a bit of an issue with that. For Durkheim, laws and even governments are just expressions of a collective cultural will. And so, if something is illegal, it's because most people in society just more or less agree that it should be. But that's not really true, is it? There are lots of laws that exist not because they represent the collective moral compass of society, but because they benefit people in power. One example of that might be marijuana prohibition in America. The vast majority of Americans are chill as fuck, or to use layman's terms, support legalization. However, weed remains illegal mostly to serve the interests of the prison industrial complex. Joe Kennedy III once explained that the reason he opposed marijuana legalization was because if it was made legal, cops wouldn't be able to use it as an excuse to claim probable cause when they pull people over for no reason.
If you smell marijuana in a car, you could search the car. When it became decriminalized, you couldn't do that.
Although, to be fair, it does kind of make sense that Kennedy might be a little nervous about cars. This is one of the key issues with functionalism. It inherently views society as a harmonious organism where all the pieces work together, and so it's much more interested in maintaining order and stability than in addressing injustices. This makes it, to say the least, a pretty conservative way of explaining things, and you can definitely see that when you look into Durkheim's work. For example, in his most famous book, he did a massive study on suicide and discovered that suicidality is linked to a lack of social solidarity, something which he believed was getting much worse as industrialization and modernity were eroding traditional social structures without providing viable alternatives. His proposed solution to this was to create new sources of social solidarity by, you guessed it, giving capitalists almost complete control over every aspect of their employees' lives. Much as I hate to admit it, history did prove him right on that one. I mean, we do all know how famously happy Amazon workers are. Now, to be fair to Durkheim here, he did also believe that crime is a good way to change society. He figured that if a law is unjust, then the way to make people realize that is by breaking it.
Crime implies not only that the way remains open to necessary changes, but that, in certain cases, it directly prepares these changes. Where crime exists, collective sentiments are sufficiently flexible to take on a new form, and crime sometimes helps to determine the form they will take. It would never have been possible to establish the freedom of thought we now enjoy if the regulations prohibiting it had not been violated before being solemnly abrogated. At that time, however, the violation was a crime, since it was an offence against sentiments still very keen in the average conscience.
Now, while I do think it's reasonable to read that quote as Durkheim supporting the use of civil disobedience to fight injustice, woke king that he was, Durkheim was actually pretty racist towards Indigenous people in Australia, so maybe not that woke. But most functionalists are definitely not coming away from reading Durkheim ready to go dumpster diving for food, not bombs. The functionalist perspective is inherently interested in maintaining the order of society, not in changing it. If you want to do that, well then mask up, comrades. Let's talk about conflict theory.
So, Air Canada gal literally follows the trail of blood and it leads her to her worst fear.
Uh-oh.
She finds the love of her life, Dolphin Girl's lifeless body. She was lying on the floor dehydrated and clutching a stab wound as if she had broken free from her bonds and made it all the way down the hall where she finally collapsed and died.
So, she was actually able to escape from the rope and make it down the hall before dying?
Right, that's what I just said.
The conflict theory of sociology kind of came as a response to functionalism. While functionalists view history as periods of stability punctuated by brief moments of unrest, conflict theorists see the exact opposite. And while functionalists believe that if you want to understand something, you need to ask what it does for society, conflict theorists say that if you want to understand something, you gotta ask who's getting fucked over. For example, 2 years ago up here in Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also known as the Mounties, the RCMP, or Horse Pigs, were planning to use live ammo on the Wet'suwet'en people who were defending their land from being illegally stolen and destroyed to make an oil pipeline. However, now that commercial fishermen are illegally preventing the Mig-Mah people from fishing on their land through threats, intimidation, assault, destruction of property, and arson, the RCMP have now said that, ooh, sorry, that's actually not a police issue. I'm just kidding there. They didn't say sorry. Now, while for me personally, I'm not a huge fan of the police existing, I have always pictured police abolition as sort of a slow process where more and more of the police's responsibilities would be placed into the hands of different organizations and members of the local communities. Call me a lib, but I certainly wasn't thinking that fucking arson investigations would be first on the chopping block. Regardless, I don't know how you could really argue that that makes sense as an expression of any collective conscience. Like, the only coherent sentiment that you could glean from that would just be that genocide is good, actually. But Durkheim was actually pretty racist towards indigenous people in Australia, so maybe... Actually, yeah, that does check out. No, but I mean, even if you do think that that's an acceptable moral position, first of all, eat shit, and secondly, I don't think that you can reasonably argue that vigilante justice is an acceptable part of a stable society. Going back to Joy Wiltenburg's paper on the history of true crime. Oh yeah, that's what this video is supposed to be about. She makes an extremely interesting observation about the history of true crime and really crime itself.
In the Western world, the modern concept of crime draws on older conceptions of sin, but focuses expressly on acts that are forbidden and punishable by human authority. As a violation of public order, crime came to new prominence with the emergence of increasingly effective states and judicial systems in the later Middle Ages. Of course, violent acts like those featured in sensationalist accounts were also committed in the early Middle Ages and became the subject of discourse, although not in the forms later taken by sensationalism. Medieval chronicles record acts of mayhem and murder committed by noblemen and rulers against each other. Unlike the events recounted in later sensationalism, these violent clashes lacked an ordering authority to seal their significance and focused the action on a single miscreant and his punishment.
Essentially, the very concept of crime is contingent on the enforcement of state power, not like whatever society agrees to vibe with. In fact, the collective conscience can and very often is shaped by the media and the state, who move the Overton window to wherever is most convenient to serve their interests. And by the way, like, don't get me wrong here, it definitely doesn't mean that you, like, support genocide if you're interested in Durkheim's theories or anything. Folks, please do not harass Emil Durkheim. I shouldn't have to say this because he died over 100 years ago, but do not start swarming his replies or sending him threatening messages, if for no other reason than because it reflects badly on me. But seriously, like, asking what does X do for society is a very interesting and useful line of questioning, as I hope I've demonstrated by asking that about true crime in this video. We do, after all, live in a society. It's just important to remember that very often things are the way they are not because they're natural or agreed upon, but because people with power wanted them that way.
When the police arrived, all eyes were on Air Canada gal. She was the one who allegedly found the body, and yet there were no signs of forced entry.
What? Big red flag for me there.
Yeah, and the police noted that she was a little bit too forthcoming with information, which they found suspicious.
Is it possible the nature of their relationship was also an issue? Like, an airplane and a dolphin. Both women. Seems a little cray-cray.
Yeah, so police call that type of thing intuition, and while not officially, it likely did play a role.
So they arrested Air Canada gal?
Yes, she was thankfully arrested and charged with the murder of Dolphin Girl, which now means that her dolphin family can rest easy knowing their daughter's killer is safely behind bars.